So you heard Sonika introduce me, and you saw that I lived long enough to have done many things, with the result that today I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. I'm really thankful to Professor Garg for inviting me to speak, because on one hand I always speak of only very simple things, because I don't know anything complex, and on the other I say many weird things which most people don't agree with. I bring to you all the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, where I live and work, as you heard. Let me start with a platitude, not always the best way to start. Truth is one, and both science and spirituality seek the truth. Now, having said that, I may add that part of the truth is also truth, and there can be something like the whole truth, which includes all part truths. Now let's look at the truth that spirituality seeks. The truth that spirituality seeks is how did it all begin? The material universe as we observe it. What is the relationship, if any, between the creator, if any, and its creation? And what is the role of the individual in fulfilling the design of the creator? On the other hand, the truth that science seeks is what are the secrets of nature? Are there some laws of nature? And how can the secrets and laws discovered be used to control nature, master nature for our convenience and comfort? Now, following this line of inquiry, what spirituality discovered was that the world is not an accident. It was the result of an intelligent design by a designer, whom we may call the creator, and that the creator's spirit pervades all its creation. What we mean by the spirit is something which is fundamental to the creation, but it is not very visible, not very obvious. For example, when we say that the spirit of the painter is there in her painting, what we mean is that although what we see is only a landscape or a portrait, some element of the personality of the painter has got into her painting. In the same way, the spirit of the creator has got into its creation, and it's all pervasive. And that the creator continues to play a role in running the universe. In contrast, what science discovered was that the world is an accident, does not acknowledge the existence of a creator. It somehow happened. That's what science says. And that matter is primary, energy is secondary, and that the universe is run by the laws of nature, whatever that may mean, and that these laws are consistent, and therefore once discovered, we can expect that they will continue to be the same forever, or at least for a very long time, so that using those laws as a base, as a foundation, we can keep making further progress and use all the progress in science to use it for technological development and make our lives easier and more comfortable. Now this is how science was till about 120 years ago. And why even that is important to understand is that many of the elements which you find here continue to dominate the minds of the general public as well as scientists even today. And this was the result of the conflict between science and religion, which dominated the West. Fortunately, it never bothered us. And this conflict eventually, during the European Renaissance, starting from the 16th century onwards, succeeded in making the rationalists who wanted to throw away the domination of tradition and religion, which had been there for nearly 1,000 years and accounted for the dark ages of Europe. These people who were questioning those dogmas of tradition and religion on the basis of reason, they emerged sort of triumphant, and that is what set the pace for modern science and technology. All this happened just about 400 years ago, which is, in terms of history, not too long ago. And the result was that the success of the scientific enterprise led to a euphoria, and therefore there was created, even in the general public's mind, on one hand, a disbelief in the existence of anything like God or spirit, and on the other, we came to equate science with truth. Although science never claimed it, science was about discovering parts of the truth bit by bit and then asking more questions to keep extending the boundaries of truth. It never claimed that it is the whole truth. And on the other hand, the general public, the masses, including the scientists, came to believe that something scientific is synonymous with what is true, good, valid, and worthwhile. Now, these are not synonyms, but all the same, that's what we came to think. And therefore, it's not surprising that one of the early Renaissance scientists, Pascal, lived in the 17th century, did not believe in God most of his life. It was only towards the end that he revised his ideas. He started believing in God, but most of his life he didn't believe in God. You know, this a famous quote of his that I have no need for God for all that he was discovering in science. But all the same, the influence of the church probably had not completely disappeared, and there was somewhere in the mind that type of fear which is characteristic of Semitic religions, the fear of God, and therefore he came up with this famous sort of set made of these 4 rectangles, that either you may believe in God or you may be an atheist and not believe in God. If you believe in God and you turn out to be right, then you get eternal joy, because on one hand you will be a good person, on the other hand God will love you. And even if you are wrong and you believe in God, nothing much would happen, so you don't lose anything. On the other hand, if you are an atheist, do not believe in God, and you turn out to be right, you don't gain anything. And on the other hand, if you happen to be wrong, then God might punish you, or you may lead a sinful life, and therefore you may have eternal suffering. So this at least indicates an open mind, but this is where he left it most of his life, except towards the end, and he didn't live very long. Now, somewhere around 1909, actually exactly in 1909, Aurobindo made a famous speech, the Uttarpada speech, in which he said Sanatana Dharma can triumph over materialism by including and anticipating the discoveries of science. Why triumph over materialism? Because in science, we considered matter to be primary and energy is secondary. So he says that Sanatana Dharma has those elements which can triumph over materialism by including and anticipating the discoveries of science. Because this had already started happening by 1909, Einstein came up with his theory of special theory of relativity in 1905, and this had set the pace for scientists having some doubts about the dogmas that had been held. And let's try and see what Einstein actually did. What he did essentially was to abolish the dogma established by Descartes of a strict dichotomy between mind and matter. Matter is something solid, something objective, something which we can study properly. Mind is something wishy-washy, and the two are entirely distinct. What Einstein did was to abolish this. That was the beginning, and of course what followed, the quantum theory and so on, all those things only strengthened the idea that science, as we had looked upon, as it had looked upon reality, and which appealed to common sense, was not the ultimate way to look at reality, even in science. So that's what Aurobindo wrote in The Life Divine a few years later, that an insistence on the soul or fundamental validity of the objective real takes its stand on the sense of the basic reality of matter. But it is now evident that matter is by no means fundamentally real, it is a structure of energy. Because this is something which had become scientifically valid by around 1910. That's when he started writing The Life Divine. It went on from about 1910 to 1914. So as a result of all these developments in physics, which I am not an expert on, and therefore I am taking the risk of talking about them without understanding them enough, the result of all these developments in theoretical physics has been that now science recognizes three layers of reality. The first layer is the most easy to understand, that is the observable universe of material objects. That is what the old science before 1905 supported, and that is what is in keeping with our common sense and everyday observations. But then the theory of relativity made many weird things quite acceptable in science, and then in the second layer of reality we started looking upon everything that exists in the material universe as a ceaseless interplay of energy, and that all matter is composed of quarks and electrons. Quarks in the nucleus, which make up the protons and the neutrons, and the electrons. And these particles, in fact, are extremely tiny and leave a lot of empty space. And therefore, it doesn't really appeal to common sense that it's solid wood actually is more empty space than solid. Which means that basically there is energy, and at some points this energy has condensed as if to form some tiny bits of these particles which make up everything that we have around us. So on one hand, we have something basic which is common to all material, which points to a common source, one source for everything. And on the other hand, this bridges sort of the gap between non-material and material. Non-material energy can, under certain circumstances, condense to form material particles. And this is what spirituality talked about when it talked about the creation of the universe, that to start with, before the material universe existed, we only had a non-material entity whom we may call the creator, and since it was all-powerful, it could do everything. One of the things it could do was to become matter for creating the universe which it wanted to create. So the same non-material entity, that supreme consciousness, now manifested itself as matter, and therefore matter is nothing but another form of the creator. And since it is nothing but another form of the creator, now as a corollary it follows that the creator pervades all its creation, and that is what we call the spirit. So this was another way of looking at the same thing, but I'll not say that this has proven or disproved the way we look at it in spirituality. It has just given us a way of looking at reality which is consistent with spirituality. And there's a third layer of reality, which is that there are fields, manifest and unmanifest. It is here that things get even more weird, and this I don't understand at all. So I have taken support from Mani Bhaumik, an eminent physicist who discovered laser, which is used for eye surgery, and that's what also made him rich and famous. And he has a beautiful book called Code Name God. He says that unmanifest fields pervade all space and time, and they are known as quantum fields. The unmanifest fields influence is non-local in the sense that it is felt equally in all parts of the universe. Now in spirituality, again, we often talk about there being a unified field of consciousness in which there is a continuum, in which we do not require any medium for communication to take place. from one part of this field of consciousness to another, with the result that a person thinking of somebody in New York could perhaps raise some ripple in the minds of that person in New York and make him feel somebody has remembered me. So this is something which modern theoretical physics would explain in terms of the non-local influence, in the sense that it is felt equally in all parts of the universe. Comprehending this intrinsic fundamental reality of our cosmos is a key to grasping how science supports the concept of the one source. Now, I have put science in two columns. The first column is the same as what I showed earlier. That is the science before 1905. And the second one, after the theory of relativity. Now, while earlier we looked upon science, so upon the world as an accident, even now, science does not necessarily acknowledge the existence of God or a creator, but at least it finds that there may be one common source for all creation. And matter is primary, energy is secondary. That was the dogma in science earlier. Now, energy is primary and matter is secondary. It's all energy fields, and the particles are not even revolving around the nucleus. The electrons are not revolving around the nucleus as we came to learn in chemistry long back. Now, what they say is it's something like a spray of electrons, which hits sort of a spray, of electrons, just like a spray of water which may emanate from an ocean. It hits a stone and then comes back, and then another spray, and you have another set of fine droplets. All these individual droplets are exactly the same, but same in terms of their characteristics, but not exactly the same neutrons or the same droplets which existed earlier. So it is just a sort of a ceaseless play of energy condensing into very fine minute particles, leaving a lot of empty space and creating an illusion of solid material universe. Now, whether we call it energy or we call it the spirit does not really matter much. Energy seems a little more acceptable term in science, and that's why we keep talking only in terms of matter and energy. We've just shifted from matter being primary and energy secondary to energy being primary and matter is secondary, but we could substitute spirit for energy, and we would become the spiritual worldview. Then the universe is run by the laws of nature that we continue to believe in. Now, all this was received very enthusiastically by a very large number of scientists, because somewhere in our blood we have this feeling, some sort of a dim awareness, that probably there is something beyond the obvious, some higher power which may be behind all this amazing phenomenon that we call the universe. And therefore, when they found that science need not be dogmatic about rejecting such a possibility, they were in fact relieved, and some of them went on to write. Some of the famous physicists like Fritjof Capra and Mani Bhomik and many others went on to write books on how the findings in modern theoretical physics are fully consistent with the spiritual worldview. But at the same time, there were those who did not want to acknowledge it, like Richard Feynman. So there were both types of scientists, but to many scientists, this came as a welcome relief, and therefore they received these findings enthusiastically, not only because it was progress in science, but in some way confirmed some of their deeply held beliefs which they were forced to reject when they were working in a science lab. In fact, it's amazing that people in science, particularly those who study biological sciences, should reject God, because when you go into the minute details of how the human body works and how at the molecular level you have such engineering in terms of shape and charge which runs sort of like a well coordinated orchestra and gives us good health as well as the capabilities of fighting disease. So whether we look at the immune system or any other system of the body and look at the interplay of the molecules, it's really interesting how a scientist can fail to wonder and appreciate the one who put all this in place, because understanding it is one thing, creating it is another, and we don't even fully understand it yet. So how much of intelligence would have gone into creating it? And that's what Aurobindo here is talking about, that science reveals to us how minute is the care, how cunning the device, how intense the absorption it bestows upon the smallest of its works, even as on the largest. So the ingenuity that goes into creating a clod of clay or a small little insect is no less than the ingenuity that goes in creating a human being. Because suppressing something which you are capable of requires just as much ingenuity as expressing it. And what all it could do does not express fully even in human beings. So the result of all this was that science itself started stretching its limits, and soon after the physicists, the next set of scientists to jump into the bandwagon were the neurophysiologists. And here are three distinguished neurophysiologists from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. From the left to the right, Professor B.K. Anand, the founder of the Department of Physiology at AIIMS. In the center, Professor Baldev Singh, who was Professor Emeritus in the Department of Physiology but started as a Professor of Neurology. And on the right, Professor Gulzar Singh Cheena, another Professor of Physiology at AIIMS. Now these three professors, they were among the pioneers in the research on yoga. And in 1961, they came up with three publications which have become classics in scientific literature on yoga. Here I'll show you one of them, which is on meditation, because that is what this seminar is about. Here what they did was to study the EEG, the electroencephalogram of ordinary people, of yogis before meditation and during meditation. Now before meditation, when they behaved more like ordinary people, you find that the alpha rhythm, which is the rhythm of inattention, when the person is relaxed, awake but relaxed and inattentive, this rhythm can be easily disturbed if the person is given a stimulus in the form of a vibration, say with a tuning fork, or a hot tube is touched, a tube containing some hot water is touched on any part of the body. We find that the alpha rhythm disappears and gets replaced by the rhythm of attention, which is the beta rhythm. But during meditation, the alpha rhythm continues in spite of the vibration and the hot tube, which means the person is able to avoid paying any attention to these stimuli during the state of meditation. Relatively recent studies, one which became very famous because the writers then went on to write a book, Why God Won't Go Away. These studies were done on these were brain imaging studies. Imaging studies means, you can see in the image which parts of the brain are active and which are not active. So they did this in some nuns and meditating Buddhists, and they found that during their peak spiritual experience, there was a reduction in the activity of those parts of the brain which pay attention to sensory stimuli, and instead some other parts of the brain became more active, and the activity in these other parts, which did not clearly sort of delineate a stimulus in terms of the nature of the stimulus and its location, etc., this created some sort of a unitive experience bordering on spiritual experience. And the interpretation was that the peak experience which these people report is correlates in the changes in the activity of the brain. Now these are all correlates. This is not proving or disproving anything. Let's sort of keep that in mind. So it is consistent with the spiritual worldview. The spiritual worldview can have some correlates which you can detect in the brain, and still later studies have also shown that in long-term meditators, certain parts of the brain which are more active during meditation, the cortical thickness can increase in those parts. So all those studies are there, but all these are correlates. But the unbridged gap that still remains is that while science treats consciousness or awareness as an emergent property of the brain, That is, certain parts of the brain are active, and therefore this is what we feel, this is what we experience. In spiritual terms, we look upon the brain as only an instrument that channelizes a fraction of the universal consciousness. So the fraction that we are able to channelize depends on the instrument. For example, the radio waves may be there all over, but what we are able to sample will depend upon our receiver, whether it's a radio or a TV or whatever it is. So it depends upon what type of receiver we use. And it seems in the course of evolution, nature has been devising better brains, more complex brains, so that they'll be able to sample more and sample a different type of material from the universal consciousness. And that is how the human brain differs from animal brain. It can sample a lot more, but then not necessarily more in every field. For example, with our brain, we can't smell as well as a dog. So it's not that in every respect we have improved, but depending upon the necessity, the instrument has been changing, and all what these instruments are doing is sampling or channelizing a small part of the universal consciousness, whatever is essential for the survival of that particular animal. Then after this, we had clinical studies in medical disciplines, and the stimulus came initially from the relationship between prayer and healing, because the mind-body relationship is understandable. That is, if the patient thinks positively, he can use his positive thinking to heal himself. But somebody else wishing that he should get better, and that actually making him better, is something that defies common sense. But then we have seen that truth does not necessarily follow common sense. So there have been scientists who have tried to study this using scientific methods. And they have used fairly good criteria of science in these studies. The results also have been weakly positive, but this is one subject in which a foolproof study cannot be done. And there is one study available just on this. There was one group of scientists who thought, we'll settle this issue once and for all. We'll do that one study which will settle this issue once and for all. So they sat and discussed how they would design their experiments. And after several rounds of discussions, they came to the conclusion that a foolproof study on this subject cannot be done. And that itself was published as a paper in the Archives of Internal Medicine. That was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine, a very prestigious journal in medicine. Now, why this study cannot be done? Because the standard way to assess a new drug is to do a randomized, double-blind, randomized controlled trial, so that the patient doesn't know what he's getting, the investigator also doesn't know what a particular patient is getting, and you have one group of people receiving this new drug and another getting either the old drug or no treatment at all, which is the control group. So in this, the studies on prayer, what they did was, had these two groups of people, one being prayed for, another not being prayed for. The people who were praying didn't know for whom they were praying, and the people who were being prayed for also did not know that they were being prayed for. So it was double blind, it was randomized, everything was done. And the results were also weakly positive in most of these studies. But then what is the flaw? The flaw is, firstly, that the investigator has organized everything, but then both these groups of patients have their own relatives and friends who may be praying for them. So actually, in both the groups, the number being prayed for is, say, the investigators have organized only for one group n number of people praying. Suppose this n number of people have another x number of people praying for them who are their relatives and friends. In the other group, it is only y number of people praying who are their relatives and friends. So both groups are being prayed for. Now, one is not sure whether n plus x is greater than y, number one. Number two, even if the numbers are greater in one than in the other, this is not a pill, and therefore it may not have a dose-response relationship. The effect may depend on the sincerity of the prayer rather than on the number praying. Then, is everybody's prayer equal? Maybe a spiritually advanced person's prayer is more effective than that of an ordinary person. Now, and further, what is the indication that prayer is working? Our criterion is survival, but is survival necessarily the best thing in terminal diseases? Maybe it may be a merciful act on the part of God to kill a person instead of prolonging his misery. So it means even our outcome is doubtful. Now, as a result of all these arguments, they came to the conclusion that a foolproof study on this subject cannot be done. But then, what has happened is that this has initiated a number of studies in which we go down the evolutionary scale. Animal studies. So 2 groups of rats, both given an incision and then stitched up. One group of rats are held by a spiritual healer for a few minutes every day. The other group is not held. So those which are held, they show that the incision heals faster. Now, this may be because these rats are getting additional attention, and therefore it may be the mind-body relationship of these rats which is at work. So we go further down the evolutionary scale. Plants. One group of plants being prayed for or being loved and cared for. The other group being just given standard sort of care. The plants grow better when you give that love to the plants. Most people who do gardening realize this. So plants do respond to love. So if plants do, maybe there can be one person's thoughts can influence another living creature. We go further down, primitive organisms like bacteria and fungi. Dr. Uma Banerjee is here, a microbiologist here. So they grow, these organisms in culture plates. The plate has all the food that this organism needs, and therefore they multiply and then they form colonies. And by counting these colonies, we can know how fast they are growing. So one group of plates being prayed for, another not prayed for. You are either praying for increase in the rate of their growth or decrease in the rate of their growth, and you find it works. The results are again positive. Go further down, cell culture studies. You have 2 groups of test tubes having cancer cells. For one group of test tubes, somebody is wishing, willing, or intending that the rate of multiplication should go down. Another group, you don't do any such thing. So the group that somebody is praying for or wishing, willing, or intending, as we put it in neutral terms in scientific literature, so this person is able to influence the rate at which the cancer cells proliferate in the test tube. Go further down, have an enzyme and a substrate in a test tube, and see if by this type of wishing, willing, or intending, you can change the reaction velocity in the test tube. Even that works. What it means is that even non-living systems like enzymes and substrates have some sort of a connection at the level of the consciousness, you may say, or at the level of a field of energy, if you speak the language of physics, but they have some sort of a communication which is possible, and which seems to be all pervasive across creation, living or non-living. And this is what lends support to the, in fact, studies on prayer and healing. Say if A is the healer and B is the patient, these dots, they indicate the all-pervasive spirit of the creator. So what A and B are essentially a condensation or a manifestation of that universal consciousness, which is also there in the air that separates them, but we don't see it. But then A has a body and a mind, B also has a body and a mind. Suppose B has a disease which affects the body of B is also a manifestation of the same supreme consciousness, and the mind of A is also a manifestation of the same supreme consciousness. The mind is a subtle manifestation, body is a gross manifestation, but they are essentially manifestations of the same. And there is no breach of continuity between A and B, because the all-pervasive spirit is there throughout, even in the gap between them. So there should be no problem in the mind of A affecting the body of B, and that is what prayer is about. That is what distance healing is about, faith healing is about, and which means, and since this communication from A to B through this is not through a physical medium, it is a communication that is instantaneous, unmitigated, and without sort of intervention of any medium, unmediated, unmitigated, and instantaneous. And this can be explained in spiritual terms, as I've tried to do here, and it can be also explained in terms of modern physics, where I believe they talk in terms of the spin of electrons. If the spin of an electron changes here, it could affect the spin of an electron in New York. So if that is possible, why not this? Sometimes we jump from these experiments and say that science has proven the spiritual way of looking at reality. But all what these experiments do is to show that we have data that is consistent with the spiritual worldview, which means that there's no conflict. They are consistent with each other, and the explanations in the two may be different. And science can neither say that its explanation is foolproof, nor can it reject. But at the same time, science can neither prove nor disprove the spiritual worldview, because the tools that it has are both inadequate and inappropriate for testing the type of truths that we are dealing with. Now, scientists can therefore take different types of a stand. What does this absence of proof really mean? If science has not proven it, what does it mean? Say a person who is meditating and goes into an altered state of consciousness. One stand can be that the altered consciousness does not exist. The second can be that the altered consciousness does not perceive the truth. What the person is perceiving in terms of a unitive experience is only a hallucination. And the third stand can be that the altered consciousness may perceive the truth, which means one keeps the mind open, but one is not sure. When scientists ask for a verification in scientific terms of spiritual truths, there is a difficulty, because in spiritual truths, the experience has been that of a spiritual master or a seer or a mystic, and that experience cannot be shared. It's the experience of just one person. And even the experiences of different persons could be different, because Aurobindo says that the one who has infinite forms and is capable of infinite possibilities, why should he reveal himself in exactly the same way to every spiritual seeker? So even the question on enlightenment in the previous session, why should everybody's enlightenment be exactly the same? So even that may not be. But all the same, if you look at the way some of these seekers have described their spiritual experiences in writing, some of them have put it down in writing, you find that there's a remarkable similarity between the experiences of different spiritual seekers, be they the rishis of the Hindu tradition, or Sufis of the Islamic tradition, or mystics of the Christian or the Judaic traditions. And the descriptions are remarkably similar, in spite of their being separated in terms of tradition, geography, and time. And many of these comparable descriptions have been brought together at one place in a book called The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. So that itself constitutes an evidence of sorts. But then this handicap of the experience not being demonstrable to others in a laboratory the way scientific evidence can be demonstrated, that handicap does remain. But then if in science, suppose a scientist says that this leaf, which looks like a green sheet of paper, is actually made up of thousands of cells, and somebody tells him that I don't believe you because I don't see the cells. What does the scientist say? The scientist says that I used a microscope to see these cells. If you use a microscope, you will also see the cells. Which means that to get the same experience, we should use the same methods, which have been used by the person who had the experience. Secondly, we should have faith in the method, because we should have faith in the microscope, that the microscope is only a magnifying instrument. It does not create images de novo. It's only making whatever is actually there look bigger. It's not creating an image. So we should have faith in the instrument. So the rishi or the mystic says the same thing. If you don't believe in my experience, you can experience it for yourself if you use the same methods which I have used. But then are we willing to use the same methods which the rishis and the mystics have used? What are these methods? There are two essential ingredients: intense concentration and extreme degrees of self-purification. If we are not willing to use this combination, then we may or may not believe in that what that person is saying, but we cannot question the fact of his experience. We cannot say that the type of experience he had is not possible because I do not have that experience. That is not sufficient reason to say such an experience itself is not possible. If I'm not willing to use a microscope, I cannot say that the experience of seeing the cells in a leaf is not possible because I can't see the cells. Second question that arises when it comes to spiritual truths, is scientific verification really necessary? It's not really necessary because the domain of the two is different, and therefore scientific verification is not really, strictly speaking, necessary in this area. And the rishi or the mystic who has the experience is fully convinced that it is true. It may be a subjective experience, but then he finds it as real, or perhaps more real than the reality we observe in the physical universe in terms of the material objects. He finds it more real than that. But then why does scientific verification seem necessary? It seems necessary, although it is not necessary, because over the last 400 years, science has so revolutionized our lives that we live under a spell of science, and we have been hypnotized by science, and we started equating it with everything that is good, true, valid, and worthwhile. And that is why it seems that if something has to be accepted, it must be validated by modern scientific methods. That is why it seems necessary. And the consequences of this obsession with scientific proof can be sometimes undesirable. It can lead to a lot of pseudoscience. And what is that pseudoscience? This type of experiments in which you just have a person who claims to have a spiritual experience or does some spiritual practices, and then you do a large number of measurements on him, measurements in terms of things like the EEG or other types of brain imaging or biochemical tests which you measure various hormones. So you do a very large number of measurements on that person, and you produce a large amount of data. And then you say, see, this data, this person's variables, these values are different from those of other people, and therefore we have proven that this is something valid. It has not really proved anything. It has neither proved nor disproved anything. A lot of data does not necessarily mean that this spiritual worldview has been proved or disproved. Secondly, it leads to wrong interpretation of results, while the scientist himself may very carefully say that these are the correlates of this state of consciousness, this type of brain activity, or these facts are consistent with the spiritual worldview. The general public uncritically jumps to the conclusion, now science has proven the spiritual worldview. So that leads to a misinterpretation of results. So spiritualists tend to have a misplaced sort of an enthusiasm sometimes, and say that the spiritual masters discovered what science is discovering now long ago. But then what we forget is that spiritual masters were not actually seeking scientific facts. They discovered a layer of reality which modern science has discovered only recently by other methods and is expressing in its own language. That is different, but spiritual masters were not seeking scientific facts. They were seeking basic existential questions, answers to basic existential questions, and not with the idea of controlling nature, but with the idea of understanding nature, not with the idea of becoming more comfortable by controlling and mastering nature. Secondly, precedence is sometimes overrated. They did it long back, therefore they are superior. Now, precedence by itself does not translate into superiority. If somebody has discovered something in science and another person discovers it 100 years later independently without knowing the previous research, the second person is no way inferior to the first one. So precedence by itself does not constitute superiority. Third is, to the spiritual masters, it did not matter how these facts would be used, interpreted, etc. by scientists. And the fact is that science has added depth and detail to a certain aspect of the truth, because the material world is also a part of the whole truth, which spirituality is about, and science has added considerable depth and detail to it, which spiritual masters had not been able to do. As Aurobindo says in The Life Divine, earth is his footing. The creator's footing, says the Mandukya Upanishad, whenever it images the self that manifests in the universe. And it is certainly the fact that the wider we extend and the surer we make our knowledge of the physical world, which means if we understand the physical world better, the wider and surer becomes our foundation for the higher knowledge, even the highest, even for the Brahmavidya. So understanding the physical universe better helps us understand the whole truth better, because this is also part of that truth. It's the spiritual truth which is the whole truth. And understanding one part of it, which science has been able to do in great detail, helps us understand that total knowledge better. The dilemma of spiritual enthusiasts is obvious from these two rather contrasting stands that they sometimes take. One is spirituality discovered all of science long ago, which means therefore spirituality is superior to science. Now, if it is superior, then why the second stand? Science has now proved spiritual truths. Then why do you want to seek a certification from science if spirituality is superior? I could end this with a quote from Fritjof Capra, an eminent physicist. Science does not need mysticism, it can survive without it. And mysticism does not need science, but men and women need both. And life becomes complete